The following program presents principles designed to promote good health and is not intended to take the place of personalized professional care. The opinions and ideas expressed are those of the speaker. Viewers are encouraged to draw their own conclusions about the information presented.
Hello and welcome to Health for a Lifetime. I'm your host, Don McIntosh. We're glad you joined us today. We're going to be talking about a very important subject today, anorexia and bulimia, eating disorders. Many times they affect ladies, women, but also some men are affected. It's not the largest problem in America because many people are suffering from diseases of overabundance, but there are a few that really struggle with this, and joining us to talk about this is a survivor of this very problem, a survivor of anorexia, Jennifer Jill Swerzer, and she has a webpage, jenniferjill.org, and we're excited about the material that she's sharing and about the book that you've written, Dying to Be Beautiful. Excellent book. You've put a lot of research into this and pulled together a multidisciplinary team, a registered dietitian and a psychologist, and you've got some very good reviews on this book. And what I like about it is that it comes from your own personal perspective as well.
Yeah, I wove a lot of stories in and out of the main text that was more, research. I put 10 stories of survivors woven into the book, so there's a lot of personal interest, and it reads well.
And you've told me that this is a problem for what percentage of people in America?
Well, we're looking at a lifetime prevalence rate for anorexia of about 0.5%, so it's not a large percent. Bulimia is higher, 1 to 3% lifetime prevalence, but that prevalence drastically increases for a certain age population and a certain gender, and that is young women, women between the ages of 15 and 25.
And we've talked about how this came as a result of just of movement in people's minds from fat being where it was at, so to speak. In other words, that was a sign of affluence. Then the thin being in, and that wasn't always the case. I mean, when you looked at those pictures of the Mona Lisa and others, you see that, hey, there's been a big shift in what people think is beautiful.
Right.
Social revolution, industrial revolution, sexual revolution, all those things factored in. Until
today, our young women are beholding these images of catwalk models, and I specified before that thinness isn't in everywhere, but it's particularly in the fashion industry, and particularly the catwalk fashion industry, where these women showcase the new fashions, and they value very thin bodies because the clothes simply hang on their bodies like they would on a coat hanger, so the focus is on the clothes and not on the girl. And so the young women are seeing these images and taking this in, and that's what they idealize, and partly as a result of that, eating disorders are much more common among young women.
So today we want to kind of grapple with the causes and effects of these eating disorders, and you want to give us some definitions of eating disorders.
I want to define anorexia and bulimia for you. According to the American Psychiatric Association's Diagnostic Manual, we're going to look at the criterion. First of anorexia, let's look at the next graphic. These have been paraphrased, but you get the point. These are the characteristics of anorexia nervosa. A refusal to maintain body weight of more than 85% of normal weight. In other words, you're 15% underweight or more. Intense fear of becoming fat is a characteristic of anorexia. Denial,
obsession
with body weight,
self-worth is tied unduly
to weight. And so people are in denial of their condition, and not only that, but they're very focused on attaining this low weight, and that consumes them, and they define themselves in those terms.
Amenorrhea?
Amenorrhea is the loss of the monthly cycle. That is a characteristic of anorexia nervosa, and that has to happen for 3 consecutive months in order for them to qualify.
The diagnosis.
That's right. And so those 4 criterion are what constitute a diagnosis. All of them have to be in place. with this caveat that there are two types of anorexia. One is the binging purging type, and the other is the restricting type. The binging purging type can sometimes be mistaken for bulimic because they binge and purge, but bulimics aren't generally underweight.
What does nervosa mean?
You know what? I don't know. I was thinking about that. I need to look that up. You caught me.
Okay, anorexia.
I think it has to do with nerves, but I'm not sure. I need to look that up. Anorexia means loss of appetite, which is not true, because anorexics obsess about food. They're always hungry. They're like starvation victims. So it's a misnomer.
Okay.
Okay.
So what is the impact of anorexia on the body?
On the body. Okay, well, let's look at that. Everything in the body slows down, and in a sense, it dries up. Okay? Because you're not fueling your body, you're not really hydrating your body, and so it's going to ratchet itself down into what is basically survival mode. Blood pressure lowers, pulse lowers, respiration slows down, digestion slows down. People become constipated. They become dehydrated. They're kind of like a fish out of water. And all of this is an attempt on the body's part to slow down, to ratchet everything down. It's because they're in conservation mode. Okay, we're starving now, and we need to slow everything down just to get through this starvation period until there's food available. Again, that's what the body is saying. Often there's a cold intolerance. That's because of very little body fat, but it's also because of thyroid changes, inability of the body to keep itself warm. There's very dry skin and hair. The body doesn't want to waste any extra oil or any extra resources on keeping the hair moist and the skin moist, so that becomes dry. In severe cases, you can develop something called lanugo, which is a fur that develops on the body, and it's in fact the body's last-ditch attempt to stay warm.
It's kind of like when you have that one before you're born in the womb.
That's right. Similar. Estrogen drops, and there's a lot of consequences as a result of dropping estrogen. One being that the lining of the uterus is not shed every month, as it is in the monthly cycle, and that sets a woman up for female types of cancers. Another consequence of estrogen loss is osteoporosis. Everybody knows about the correlation between menopause and increased incidence of osteoporosis because of a drop in estrogen. Estrogen is a bone-building hormone. So if you take a woman who's in the formative stage of life, which young women are, they're still building their bones, and you take away the estrogen, or a lot of the estrogen, they're going to have osteoporosis. In fact, I have osteoporosis, I believe, as a result of
going through that.
Yes, I do. Then there's insomnia. The body is basically trying to wake you up to get something to eat. Women have difficulty, or people have difficulty sleeping. And there's actual brain shrinkage. The brain is a physical organ, and we have to remember that the mind is housed in a physical organ. And so what often happens with anorexics is they have to force feed them to bring their nutrient levels up so that they will even respond to counseling or respond to any form of mental therapy, because they just won't respond because their brain is in kind of a paralyzed state.
So your electrolytes probably go off too, your potassium, your magnesium, all those different things.
That's right, and that's also a characteristic of bulimia. And let's look at the diagnostic criterion for bulimia here on the next slide. This is, again, the American Psychiatric Association's diagnostic manual, and here are the criterion for bulimia nervosa. And we need to look up that nervosa. I should have known that. Recurrent binging, eating extreme quantities and feeling out of control. And then self-induced vomiting or some kind of purging behavior using either vomiting, most often vomiting, but sometimes laxative, diuretics, enemas, fasting, or exercise. So there's a binging, purging pattern. This must happen 2 times per week for 3 months. And again, self-worth is tied unduly to weight. These people become obsessed with this pursuit of the perfect body and with food, and that becomes who they are, and it can be very challenging to try to talk to someone in that condition.
So 2 to 3 times per week for 3 months?
I think that's what it said, yeah.
Yeah, so...
And so do you want to look at the way that bulimia impacts the body?
Yeah, I want to see. We looked at how anorexia does it. What does bulimia do?
Okay, you mentioned a few moments ago about...
electrolytes.
Electrolyte imbalances. There are heart irregularities that can come about as a result of bulimia because of the throwing off of the electrolytes,
Potassium.
particularly potassium, and that can cause something called malignant cardiac arrhythmia. This is what Karen Carpenter, the singer, died of. Ironically, she was in her closet getting ready to go out and celebrate a recent weight gain. I believe she was an anorexic because she was quite underweight, but she was, I believe, a binging, purging type of anorexic, and she had a potassium imbalance that led to a heart attack, and she dropped dead in her closet. This is also what is believed to have happened to Terry Schiavo. She had a binging, purging pattern going, and it was believed that she had a heart problem because of that. Another consequence of bulimia is overexpansion of the stomach. These people are eating huge quantities of food. The largest quantity I've heard of is 50,000 calories.
50,000
in
calories.
1 day. So the average intake of calories is 2,000, right? Right around 2,000. So that's how many times more? That's like
off the charts.
like 25 times more.
Yeah.
So it's huge. So we're talking huge quantities of food, binging and purging, 50,000 calories in a day's time, many different binges. So there's overexpansion of the stomach. Because of the contact of stomach acid with the esophagus, it sets a person up for esophageal cancer. They can also develop hoarseness. I met a girl in the course of my research whose singing voice had been affected by bulimia, and she was a singer and enjoyed singing, but she says, my voice will never be the same. The parotid glands, for some reason, they don't know why, but the parotid glands on the sides of the neck swell in bulimia, and the person develops a chipmunk cheek appearance. So that's a giveaway sign sometimes. Sores on the backs of the fingers as a result of putting the fingers down the throat. The fingers push up against the teeth, and often bulimics will develop sores. And then tooth decay as a result of the stomach acid coming in contact with the teeth and wearing away the enamel.
So
serious impact on the body.
Right. So for both anorexia and bulimia, you can see some telltale signs. What about the psychological factors?
Okay. Well, let's talk about causes. I think the causes are multiple. I think we have three basic categories, or I break it down into three categories. One is biological, things in people's genetic code, so to speak, and I'm going to talk about that for a moment. But then there are psychological factors. There are things that can set a person up for developing an eating disorder, that are in their family of origin, that are in their individual psyche. And then the third factor is, of course, cultural factors, which we've been talking about.
Okay. So what about the biological again? We've talked about. What are those factors?
Okay, there is an association between particularly bulimia and major affective disorder, which affective disorder has to do with the mood.
So like bipolar is what we usually call that.
Well, it's not just bipolar. Major affective disorder is kind of an overarching category, and under that category comes bipolar, comes depressive disorder, anything that affects the mood or the emotions. Affective means mood, means emotions. So there is an association between particularly bulimia and major affective disorder. In other words, if the person has major affective disorder in their family, they're going to have a greater likelihood of developing bulimia. And that's good news, because
that can be treated.
That's right. And bulimia does respond to antidepressant use. So.
And then psychological factors?
Okay, psychological factors, when I say that, I mean specifically things in the individual or in their past history or in their family of origin. I'm not talking about the psychological impact of cultural factors. That I'm putting in a separate category, just for the sake of organizing all the information. So what I found in my study was that there was a relationship, there was a greater incidence of eating disorders developed in women who had been the victims of incest. It was much greater than the incidence of eating disorders in women who had been the victims of abuse. Just abuse. Somehow incest is a greater invasion, and one study that I read broke it down this way. It said that people develop their social skills in their family of origin. If there's incest in a family, it's a good indication that the family relationships are so askew that the family is not a good environment for the development of social skills. And as a result, they come into adulthood without social skills. There's isolation from relationships in general, because they've never developed that ability, and as a result they set themselves up for all kinds of addictions, including eating disorders.
We're talking with Jennifer Swerzer. She's done a book on anorexia and bulimia called Dying to be Beautiful: We're going to continue looking at the causes, but then also some good news about how we can find help and hope. We've been talking with Jennifer Swerger. She's written a book, Dying to Be Beautiful, and a lot of the information that we've been covering you can access on her website, jenniferjill.org. And how's that spelled, Jennifer? Jennifer.
Traditional spelling, JENNIFER.JILL.org.
Okay.
Yeah,
And they can find information about the book, which was published by Review and Herald. Excellent book. Did a lot of research. Fascinating to see some of the things you've been saying about the factors, the biological factors. You know, I used to, of course, from time to time work on an eating disorders unit. And we saw a lot of people, 16 years old, 17 years old, people coming in with heart attacks, all from this. It's a significant problem. Then you also talked about the psychological factors.
Right.
You were describing the connection between specifically incest and an increase
That's right.
level of those that are struggling with anorexia or bulimia that's associated with that because of the invasion of their personal privacy. What else about psychological factors?
Okay, there are certain characteristics, psychological characteristics that have been identified in women with eating disorders, and they would be body dissatisfaction, not surprisingly. They're not happy with their bodies. We dwelt pretty heavily on that previously. Something called negative emotionality, which is just feeling bad. You know, negative emotions, depression, anxiety, anger, negative emotions. That's consistent among women and men who struggle with eating disorders. And then something called lack of interoceptive awareness.
What's that mean?
And interoceptive awareness is the ability to read what's going on inside of you. Like, I can sit here and talk to you and I can tell you I'm a little nervous, or I can tell you I'm getting hungry.
But they're not in touch with their feelings.
They aren't in touch with their feelings, and they're not able to articulate them, and this is consistently present among those that are prone to develop eating disorders.
So what are the cultural factors? You've talked about biological, psychological. Are there cultural factors?
Well, the reason I keep coming back to this issue is because that is the overarching causative factor, is what's going on in our culture today in relationship to the idealization of a very, very thin ideal of beauty, plus the pressure that's on women to look a certain way and to be beautiful, and a combination of those things creates a scenario where there's a much higher rate of anorexia and bulimia in Western cultures or Western influence cultures. In fact, eating disorders, these two types of eating disorders, are thought to be Western culture bound, meaning that you just don't find them in cultures that don't have the Western influence. And it's true that wherever Western culture invades or goes into a culture, then you start seeing a rise in eating disorders, because the overarching factor is this pressure to look a certain way and this thin, ultra-thin ideal of beauty. Now, the way it works is this. You have this overarching factor, this pressure on everybody, but not everybody reacts to it. Whether the individual reacts in developing an eating disorder is based on their individual biology and their individual psychology. So those with the weakness will develop an eating disorder, others will not.
I think you have a graphic that shows this changing shape of beauty.
Yeah. Okay, let's look at this. As the weight of Miss America winners, for instance, and you can see this in fashion magazines, you can see it in many different forms, but the weight of Miss America winners has gone down consistently since 1950 to, you know, the year 2000. Every year it's gone down, but at the same time the weight of the average woman has increased. And so again, we come back to the fat gap, the gap between the ideal and the real.
Reality.
That's right. And this sets women up for continual frustration with the way they look, which is just a common denominator among women today. But there are a few women for whom that pressure becomes overwhelming and they develop an eating disorder. Pathological dieting. Most women diet. Some become pathological in dieting, and the dieting takes on a life of its own.
So this is really dangerous. What you see on the newsstands, what you access in the media can just really, you don't know if it's going to be your child or your wife or probably more your kids as they're growing up. I mean, I have 2 young daughters.
Yeah.
And what you're telling me just makes me underline in my mind that I want to be very specific about what they see, the images they see or don't see, and help them, you know, recognize the difference between those.
You know, a bigger factor probably than anything they see on television or in magazines is what they see in their own mother. So you need to just encourage your wife that she's beautiful, tell her whatever stage of life she's at, you know, you affirm her, you love her for who she is as a total person. Even Dobson says, don't compliment your teenage daughter by telling her she's pretty. That's something she had nothing to do with. Compliment her on something that she developed in herself or something that she had some control over. And so the more you do that for your wife, the more your wife will be satisfied in who she is, and she won't be prone to scrutinize her appearance and be overly idealistic about the way she looks, and then she will pass that contentment on to her daughters. You know?
Well, honey, I believe you're beautiful for who you are. So if you're watching, I believe that. And also my daughters.
It's easy for you, though, because your wife really is beautiful. So what about a guy who's, you know...
Yeah, well, you know, that she is beautiful, but, you know, I was drawn to Luminitsa because of her mind. Her beauty was a bonus. But,
she's an architect, right?
She's an architect,
Yeah.
but she's just a very interesting, analytical, you know, vivacious person. So I was really drawn to her by that. Now,
That's
the
great.
cost of beauty you talk about.
Well, you know, we can see this beauty obsession and this appearance obsession in women reflected in other areas. For instance, the plastic surgery industry. Let's look at the next graphic here. We'll talk about what women are spending to be beautiful. I mean, what do you see on television anymore is these makeover shows.
$9.4 billion?
2003, $9.4 billion. That's a 300% increase over 6 years.
Someone's getting rich there, probably the dermatologist.
That's right.
Dieting ads.
Dieting aids, 2005.
AIDS, okay.
$40 billion. Cosmetics, 2005, over $20 billion. Beauty is expensive. We're spending lots and lots of money on it. We are not happy with who we are.
And people are taking advantage of that.
And they're taking advantage of it. That's right.
They create a false reality, and then they take advantage of it. I mean, this is the American way.
And I think the core problem here is something I like to call looksism. So I want to look at the next graphic here.
Okay, what's that?
The core problem is looksism, which is characterized by 2 main things. One is an overemphasis on physical beauty. You know, let's not lie to ourselves. Physical attractiveness is important, and we don't want to underemphasize it and pretend that it doesn't matter at all, because then we come across like we don't care about ourselves. So we need to look as best we can. But there's an overemphasis on physical appearance to the point where it becomes obsession as a result of these influences I've been talking about. The second characteristic of looksism is a distorted ideal of beauty. In other words, we don't have a normal concept anymore even of what beauty is. And you can see this throughout history, and it seems like women are always the victims of this. There's this idea that comes into the culture that a certain thing is beautiful, and then women pursue that idea in order to reach that standard of beauty to their own harm. Let's look at some examples.
Like high heels, probably.
Well, I'm going to get to that, but
oh, good.
You're giving away my punchline.
All right.
Let's look at the first graphic here. This is a corset. Now, the corset wearing is still active today in a very small population. They'll actually have ribs taken out. We talked about this before, that the internal organs are compressed. The smallest waist today is by a corset wearer, is owned by a corset wearer named Kathy Young, who is 15 inches. That's the size of a jar of mayonnaise.
So her liver is compressed, everything else.
I don't know how the body can function, but apparently it's worth it to her. But this gives you an idea of the kind of harm women will subject themselves to. Let's look at the next graphic here. In Asian cultures, foot binding was once popular. It's now illegal because it's extremely harmful, but the young female foot was broken and bound for many years until it would fit into shoes like these shoes.
Oh,
so that they would have tiny, because small feet are considered feminine, and so they would have these tiny feet and this very mincing gait. And then let's look at the next graphic here. This is popular in some of the African countries.
The elongated neck.
The neck rings. They will add the rings gradually to elongate the neck. Countries like Burma and other places. The problem is that if you took those neck rings out, the woman would die because she would not be able to support the weight of her head. Now, you may be thinking, well, we're so civilized in the Western world, but we have our own version of looksism and our own distorted ideal of beauty. So let's look in particular at evening wear. Let's look at the next graphic. Let's think about what men versus women wear in a typical formal night out. The man is dressed in a suit.
Which is what he usually wears.
Which is what he is. Men are always comfortable. Have you noticed that? Are you uncomfortable right now?
I'm probably too comfortable.
You're comfortable. So men are wearing, you know, double layers sometimes in the cold night air. Let's look at that graphic again. They're in flat shoes.
But this lady has high heels. She's on this dress.
Right.
She's going to trip down the
stairs. She has high heels. She has a long dress on. She could trip. Her back, her chest, her arms, her shoulders are exposed to the cold night air. She's wearing lots of makeup, and she's spent hours on her hair, and who knows what chemicals she has on her hair. So each one of them meets someone in the parking garage who pulls out a switchblade. Which one can defend themselves? Which one can run away? You know what I'm saying?
Well, if looks could kill, I don't know.
Yeah, exactly.
but they really can't. Yeah, in other words, it's just totally...
That's right.
Askew.
And so consistently, health, let's look at the next graphic here, is sacrificed on the altar of beauty. And that has been the case throughout the ages, and women are typically the victims of that.
So the real thing you're saying, I mean, there's biological, there's psychological, but really it's the culture, again, that's toxic. And so, you know, in looking at this, is there help, is there hope? How can we stand up against a really destructive culture?
There is help and there is hope. I'm an example of that. I'm a survivor of anorexia. And a person can deal with it, and they can go on with their lives and develop a healthy attitude.
Well, again, you know, thank you for being open about this subject. I mean, the people that are struggling with it are really struggling. They're really in danger. And I hope that if you're watching today and you know someone that's struggling with this, that you refer them to this program, or they can go to your webpage, jenniferjill.org, and figure out how to find out about this book, Dying to Be Beautiful, and really get some good tips and maybe a context to help people that are struggling with this. Thank you so much for watching Health for a Lifetime, and we hope today's program is a help to you or someone you know and love. Don't let it slip by. Use the information today.